In this video, we'll be using SAP Business Objects Data Services and using the SQL transform to connect to a database, run some SQL on it, and load that data into SAP HANA. So the first thing we need to do is to log into Data Services. So we do that by going to Start. We can access that from All Programs, Data Services, and we choose the Data Services Designer. Log in with your credentials. So for me it's student and the password is welcome1, and then it logs you into the system. So the first thing we need to do is build a project, and I'm going to call my project SQL, and then we need a job. Again, I'm going to call this SQL, and inside the job we need a data flow, and I'm going to call this SQL. So you can access your SQL transform from your transforms, which is the 5th tab in your local object library. The SQL transform is available in your list of platform transforms, and you can simply select it by dragging it on the canvas like so. What you'll notice about the SQL transform is that it has no inputs. So to give you some background, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to do the following. So I'm going to launch SQL Server Management Studio, because in this example I'm going to connect to a SQL Server database. Although the thing to note here is that if you can create a data store to a database in Data Services, any of those databases, then you'll be able to use the SQL transform. So I'm going to generate a new query, and I'll paste some sample code. Now what I'll do is I'll execute that code and I'll just explain what it's doing. It's very straightforward. Essentially it's outputting from a facts table, a flat table, the top 5 companies and some other attributes based on sum of net sales, but I am also outputting the primary key, which is just a row number based on a sequential number. So in this case 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So the great thing about this is that I can do all my work in the database client, make sure that the SQL works, and then any data store I've connected to with data services to any database, I should be able to use that SQL transform. So of course, just a couple of things of note. If I add comments, these comments will also be ignored. So you can add in whole masses of SQL statements, and as long as they work in the client, then they should work in Data Services SQL transform. So I'll copy that syntax and I'll paste it in my SQL transform in Data Services. The first thing I need to do is choose the data store that I'm connecting to. So for me, I'm going to choose the SQL Server data store, and I'll right click and I'll select paste. Again, we've tested this in the client, so if I click on update schema, it should work. Now of course here, if you double click on a target, you can change things. So I can change, if I want to, the output name, but here I'm just going to change the row ID into an integer. And lastly, I'm going to make it a primary key. So I can do a lot of processing within the SQL transform that I would need to be able to do in an additional query transform. So now that I've done that, I'm going to save my job. I'm going to close all windows. We know that everything works fine here, and I'm going to go back into my data flow. So the beauty is now we don't need a query transform. We've already built the primary key in the SQL transform. We've renamed any columns. We don't need to worry about any comments. So the actual only thing I need to do is select a template table from the right hand side, drop it into the canvas, decide on the owner name, and then give the table a name. So I'm just going to call this SQL. We don't need a query transform between the two objects. Again, we've already defined the primary key, and as you know, you need a primary key when you're creating a column store table in HANA. So once we've done this part, we're actually finished. All we need to do is execute the job by right clicking on the job and saying execute. It'll prompt to save any changes and I'll click yes, and then lastly I'll click on OK. Of course, we only selected the top 5 rows, so top 5 rows should have come across. To quickly validate, I can go back to the data flow and click on the magnifying glass in the target table, and there you can see the results. Again, I can go to SAP HANA Studio just to verify that the data actually does exist in HANA. And again, we can access this data by selecting our system, expanding the content folder, or the catalog folder, going into the schema and looking at our tables. So again, I'm going to go into my system, expand the catalog folder, go into the STS schema and look at the tables, and now we should have a table called SQL. I'll right click on that table and I'll do a data preview. And there we can see that we've got the data. If I double click on the table, we can see that it's a column store table, and yes, indeed, we do have that first row as a primary key. So that's a very simple way in which you can use SAP Business Objects Data Services to connect to any type of database data store using SQL, which is database specific. You saw an example of transforming the data slightly by adding a primary key, and we then took that data, and without any query transforms, we were able to quickly load that data into SAP HANA.